The small-town diner hums with the symphony of a morning breakfast, rush coffee cups clinking, silverware tapping, voices mingling into an everyday harmony. The smell of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee fills the air as waitresses glide between tables, balancing plates and pouring refills. Among them is Emma Reed, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile that rarely falters and a knack for making customers feel at home. Today, however, her smile fades for the briefest of moments as she overhears something that chills her. At the corner booth near the window, a young Hell's Angel biker, clad in a weathered leather jacket, sits quietly with his breakfast. His name is Tony, a regular who never causes trouble. Yet the two police officers who've just walked in have their sights set on him. Their eyes narrow, their stern expressions hardening as they stand by his table, casting a shadow over his meal. "Hey, buddy, got something to tell us?" One officer starts, his voice laced with suspicion. Tony looks up, startled but calm. "Excuse me?" he replies, his tone cautious but respectful. "You know exactly what we're talking about," the officer snaps. "Didn't we see you hanging around that gas station last night? Looked like you were waiting for some trouble." Tony's brow knits in disbelief. "I was filling up my tank and heading home, that's all." But his denial seems to ignite them further. They press harder, accusing him of loitering, stirring trouble, and making vague insinuations about his club's activities. Tony is cornered, every attempt to explain himself dismissed and met with more aggression, until Emma's voice slices through the tension like a sharp blade. "Excuse me, officers," she says evenly, stepping out from behind the counter. Her tone is calm, but there's an unmistakable edge to it. The diner falls silent, all eyes on her. Tony hasn't done anything wrong. I know him, he's been coming here for years. He's polite, pays for his meals, and doesn't bother anyone. The officers turn to her, their surprise evident. One of them smirks, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "This doesn't concern you, ma'am. Stay behind your counter." "I think it does concern me," she counters, a newfound steel in her voice. "This is my diner, and I won't stand by while one of my customers is harassed without cause. If he's broken the law, fine, but you'd better have something more than baseless accusations." The tension is palpable, the air thick with the unspoken question. Will they back down or escalate? The officers exchange a look, their authority challenged in a way they're unaccustomed to. There's a heavy pause before one of them scoffs and mutters something about watching herself. They finally back off, but not without leaving a lingering threat in the air. Tony looks at Emma, astonished and grateful. "You didn't have to do that," he says, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Yeah, I did," Emma replies firmly. "Nobody deserves to be treated like that." The incident would seem to settle, yet the undercurrent of unease remains as the day unfolds. Emma can't shake the feeling that she may have pushed her luck, but she doesn't regret stepping in. Justice, after all, isn't served by staying silent. The next morning, Emma arrives early to prep the diner for another day, her mind still replaying the events. She flicks on the lights, organizes the counter, and checks the coffee machine. Everything is just as it always is, until the distant rumble of engines reaches her ears. At first it's faint, barely perceptible, but it grows louder, closer. She steps outside to see the source, shielded from the blinding morning sun. What she sees next steals her breath. One by one, motorcycles roll into view, shiny chrome glinting, engines roaring like a thunderstorm approaching. A sea of leather-clad bikers converges on the diner's parking lot, their numbers climbing to what seems like an impossible figure. 50, 60, 70, no, surely there are 100 of them now, pulling in and forming an imposing wall of solidarity. For a moment, Emma freezes, unsure of what's happening. Are they angry? Did word of her intervention spread? And are they here to challenge her? But as the rumble dies down and the bikers dismount, her worries begin to ease. They aren't storming toward her in anger. Instead, one by one, they file calmly toward the diner. The first biker removes his helmet, revealing a face weathered by years of wind and sun, but softened by a smile. "Ma'am," he starts, his voice booming yet friendly, "thank you for standing up for Tony. Not many people would have done what you did. We came to show our appreciation." Emma's eyes widen in realization, her heart thumping. This isn't a confrontation, it's a statement. It's gratitude. And as she watches the flood of bikers lining up to enter her diner, each one offering a nod, a smile, or a simple thank you, she feels a warmth spread through her chest. Yet even as the moment settles, A question lingers in the back of her mind. What else could this unexpected alliance bring? Could it lead to something greater or something far more complicated? Just as she's about to return inside, she notices a black car parked across the street with two figures inside, watching intently. The rumble of 100 motorcycles has barely faded when Emma realizes the magnitude of what just happened. She stands in the doorway of the diner, her eyes scanning the scene of bikers milling about her usually quiet parking lot. Some are chatting casually, helmets tucked under their arms, while others glance around, remaining close to their bikes. There's a sense of camaraderie in the air, a tight-knit community that has come together for one of their own. Emma swallows nervously but manages to keep her posture composed. She steps outside, wiping her hands on her apron out of habit before forcing a smile. A group of bikers nearby notices her approach and immediately falls silent, nodding respectfully. One of them, a burly man with long gray hair combed back into a ponytail, steps forward. His leather vest is adorned with patches that tell a story of a life lived on the road, and his demeanor radiates authority. "Miss Emma, isn't it?" he asks, his voice deep but measured. When she nods, he extends a hand and adds, "Name's Bear. I'm Tony's cousin." Emma shakes his hand firmly, surprised by the softness in his tone despite his intimidating presence. "It's nice to meet you, Bear." I didn't expect anything like this." Bear chuckles, motioning around him. "We didn't mean to startle you, ma'am, but word got out fast about what you did yesterday. Standing up to those cops like that? Not many people have the guts for it these days. We wanted Tony to know, and you too, that we've got your back." Several bikers nearby murmur in agreement, their expressions stoic but supportive. Emma's cheeks flush with a mix of gratitude and unease. "I appreciate that," she replies, glancing at the line of motorcycles extending far down the block. "But you didn't have to go through all this trouble." Bear's smile fades slightly, his gaze turning serious. "With all due respect, Miss Emma, it's not just about Tony anymore. What happened in your diner wasn't just bad luck, it's part of something bigger. Some of those officers have been targeting our boys for months. Tony's just the latest excuse. When you stood up to them, it sent a message, and that matters more than you know." Emma isn't sure how to respond. The weight of responsibility settles on her shoulders, heavier than before. She doesn't regret what she did, but hearing Bear's words makes her realize how far-reaching this incident might be. She clears her throat and says, "Well, if standing up for what's right made even a small difference, then I'm glad I did it." Bear nods, visibly satisfied. That's all we needed to hear. Their conversation is interrupted by the clatter of the diner's screen door. Emma turns to see Tony approaching, his steps more assured than they'd been just yesterday. He looks between Emma and Bear before speaking up. "Cousin Bear, you didn't have to bring the whole crew," he says, his voice carrying just a hint of good-natured teasing. Bear chuckles. "Ain't about what we had to do, it's about what we wanted to do." He claps Tony on the shoulder, and for the first time, Emma sees Tony's ever-present quiet demeanor crack into a small, genuine smile. Before she can say more, the shrill ring of the diner's phone cuts through the scene. Emma instinctively steps back into the diner to answer it, leaving the murmurs of bikers behind. "Reed's Diner," she says briskly into the receiver, trying to steady her voice. "Miss Reed?" a gravelly male voice replies. She doesn't recognize it, but there's something unsettling in the measured tone. "You don't know me, but I know you, and I know what you did yesterday." Emma's stomach twists. "Who is this?" she demands, gripping the phone tighter. "Let's just say I'm someone who keeps an eye on things," the voice continues. "You made a lot of noise yesterday, stepping out of line the way you did. People like you don't always understand the consequences of crossing the wrong people. Let's hope you're smarter than I think." The line goes dead before Emma can respond. She's left gripping the receiver, her mind racing. Her first instinct is to brush it off a coward's anonymous threat, but the weight of it sits heavily in her gut. She places the receiver back in its cradle, her hands slightly trembling. When she steps outside again, the bikers sense the change in her demeanor immediately. Bear studies her face, his brow furrowing. "Something wrong, Miss Emma?" She exhales deeply, glancing at Tony and the sea of bikers watching her. Each face holds a mix of curiosity, concern, and resolve. Part of her wants to keep quiet, to shield them from becoming further entangled in whatever mess she may have started. But then she remembers the resolve that propelled her to confront those officers in the first place. Justice isn't served by staying silent. "I just got a call," she admits, her voice steady despite the storm of thoughts churning in her mind. Some guy telling me I don't know what I've gotten myself into. Sounds like a warning to back off. The crowd stirs uneasily, low murmurs rippling through the group. Tony steps forward, his jaw clenched. Who called? Did they say a name? No, Emma replies, but it was enough to make their point clear. Bear's expression hardens, his hands balling into fists at his sides. You're not alone in this, Emma. Whoever thinks they can scare you off doesn't understand what they're messing with. The tension thickens, the weight of unspoken decisions hanging in the air. Standing there in front of the bikers, Emma knows she's inadvertently become part of something bigger. She's no longer just a middle-aged waitress trying to do the right thing. She's a symbol, whether she likes it or not. And now, whether she's ready or not, the next move is hers. Just then, the distant wail of sirens slices through the tense quiet, growing louder by the second. Everyone turns toward the sound, their collective unease sharpening into something more visceral, more immediate. Looks like we've got company, Bear mutters grimly, his eyes narrowing toward the approaching noise. The blaring sound of sirens grows louder, slicing through the rising tension in the parking lot. Emma steps back closer toward the diner's door as the sea of bikers stiffen, their casual camaraderie replaced with a united front of vigilance. The low guttural hum of uneasy murmurs rolls through the group as they turn toward the source of the noise. Within moments, two squad cars roll into the lot, their red and blue lights painting the scene in an ominous, pulsating glow. The officers dismount swiftly, their hands resting on their belts too close to their holsters for comfort. Emma swallows hard, her pulse quickening. Every muscle in her body tightens, aware that the stakes of the unfolding moment have just risen. She glances sideways at Bear, whose face is stone cold, but betrays a readiness to act if this confrontation takes a turn for the worse. Behind him, Tony looks equally tense, his usually reserved demeanor amplifying into a guarded watchfulness. The lead officer, a tall man with a weathered face and an air of unearned confidence, steps forward. His eyes scan the crowd of leather-clad bikers before landing squarely on Emma. "Ms. Reed," he calls out, his voice sharp and commanding, more theatrical than it needs to be. "Quite the gathering you have here. Mind telling us why you've got half this county's biker population parked at your diner?" Emma straightens her shoulders, her voice coming out steadier than she expected. "They're customers and friends. Something I can help you with, officer?" The second officer steps forward, younger but no less hardened. He eyes the bikers with open disdain, his upper lip curling slightly. "We're here to keep the peace," he states ambiguously, standing a little too close to his partner. "A crowd like this, things can escalate if we're not careful." Bear steps forward then, his towering frame cutting an imposing silhouette against the flashing lights. "A crowd like this doesn't escalate without cause," he says evenly. His voice is calm but carries a warning edge. "We ride together. We're family. We don't start trouble, but we don't back down from it either." The younger officer bristles, his posture stiffening as though ready to retaliate, but the older officer gives a brief shake of his head, reining him in. Instead, he looks back at Emma. "Seems like you've stirred up quite the situation, Ms. Reed. Folks stepping out of line sometimes end up regretting it. This town doesn't appreciate bad examples." Emma's jaw tightens. If standing up for someone being treated unfairly is a bad example, then maybe it's this town that needs to reconsider its values. A beat of silence follows her words, the kind of silence that feels deafening in its weight. The bikers behind her shift, their unreadable expressions broadcasting silent support, yet the tension hangs thick, a live wire ready to spark at any moment. The lead officer smirks, though it doesn't reach his eyes. "Brave words," he mutters. "But bravery has consequences, Ms. Reed. Mark my words." He flicks his gaze toward the gathered bikers, his expression darkening. "All of you." Tony finally speaks, his voice low but firm. "Is that some kind of threat, officer? Because I'm pretty sure we're all standing on private property, no laws being broken here." The officer glares at him, clearly debating whether to escalate further. But before he can respond, Emma steps forward once more, her hands on her hips, cutting into his line of sight. "If you're here to write tickets for parking violations, go ahead. Otherwise, this diner is open for business. If you're not ordering, you're trespassing." Bear lets out a low chuckle behind her, the sound rumbling like distant thunder. "Ma'am knows the law better than you do, it seems." It's obvious the officers have lost this round, but their retreat is far from a victory. The lead officer tilts his head slightly as though memorizing Emma's face before turning on his heel. His younger partner lingers a moment, clearly seething, but ultimately follows without a word. The squad cars pull out of the lot, their sirens silent, leaving a heavy, unsettled quiet in their wake. As the red and blue lights fade into the distance, a collective exhale passes through the crowd of bikers. Emma, however, doesn't feel the same relief. She knows this isn't over, not by a long shot. She can feel it in the pit of her stomach, a gnawing unease that refuses to be ignored. "They're not going to let this go," she says aloud, more to herself than anyone else, but Bear hears her. He steps closer, his expression softer now but no less serious. "You're right," he admits, "but neither will we. They're poking a hornet's nest and I don't think they know it yet." Tony moves to Emma's side, his posture surprisingly protective. "You don't have to fight this alone, Emma. Whatever comes next, we're here." Emma glances between the two men, then at the larger group of bikers surrounding her. She didn't ask for this. She didn't expect to become the center of something so much bigger than herself. But as she looks at their faces, some hardened, some kind, but all resolute in their loyalty, she realizes she isn't alone anymore. Whatever battles lie ahead, she won't face them on her own. Just as she's about to respond, the soft chime of the diner's doorbell cuts through the quiet. Emma turns to see a figure slipping into the diner, moving with deliberate, almost predatory precision. Her heart skips a beat. Something about their presence feels off, wrong, like a shadow creeping into the edges of the light. Bear notices too, his eyes narrowing as he exchanges a quick look with Tony. "Stay out here," he says gruffly, already moving toward the diner's door. "I'll see what's going on." But before Emma can react, a loud crash erupts inside the diner, sending a rush of adrenaline surging through her. The bikers around her go instantly alert, their attention snapping to the door as the sound echoes out into the parking lot. Something is happening, and it's happening now. The sudden crash inside the diner feels like the explosion of a bomb, sending shockwaves through the already tense air. Emma's heart leaps into her throat. For a moment, the world around her stills a snapshot of wide eyes and halted breaths. Then, chaos erupts. Bear doesn't hesitate. He strides toward the diner, his boots hitting the pavement with purpose. Tony is right behind him, his usually quiet demeanor replaced by an expression of cold determination. The bikers outside form a cluster, their heads swiveling to keep watch on their surroundings while murmurs of concern ripple through the crowd. Emma follows, her steps hesitant but anchored by a growing resolve. Whatever's happening inside her diner, she has to face it. As they enter, the scene inside is jarring. A table has been overturned, and shards of ceramic dishes litter the floor, glinting under the fluorescent lights. At the center of the commotion stands a man dressed in dark clothing, his back to the door. He's breathing heavily, one hand resting on a counter as if he's trying to steady himself. Emma can't see his face, but the tension in his posture is evident, his like a coiled spring, ready to snap. Behind the counter, Sandy, one of Emma's waitresses, clutches a coffee pot with trembling hands, her face pale. She glances at Emma, her eyes wide with fear. He came in and started yelling," she stammers. "I tried to calm him down, but the man whirls around, cutting off Sandy's words. His face is sharp and drawn, his eyes glittering with something between anger and desperation. There's a wildness to him, a sense of unpredictability that makes everyone in the room instinctively wary. His gaze lands on Emma, and for a split second, surprise flashes across his features before it hardens into something more hostile. "You!" he spits out, pointing a finger at her. "You don't know what you've done." Emma takes a cautious step forward, raising her hands in a placating gesture. "I don't know who you are," she says calmly, though every nerve in her body screams at her to back away. "But if you want to talk, let's do it without scaring my staff." The man lets out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Talk? You think this is just about talking? You've made enemies, lady, powerful ones, and now you're dragging everyone around you into it." He gestures broadly, as if encompassing the diner, the bikers outside, the whole town. Bear steps up beside Emma, his large frame radiating quiet authority. He doesn't say anything yet, but his presence alone seems to unnerve the man, whose eyes dart to him briefly before returning to Emma. "You don't scare me," Emma says, her voice firm. The lie tastes bitter, but she refuses to let her fear show. "If you're here to threaten me, you can turn right back around. I won't be bullied into keeping quiet." The man's jaw tightens, his pale knuckles gripping the counter as though it's the only thing keeping him tethered. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about you anymore. They're watching everything, every move you make, every person you talk to. You think those cops yesterday were bad? That's just the surface. Outside, the bikers shift uneasily, their silhouettes visible through the diner's windows. Emma can sense the weight of their worry, their readiness to intervene if things escalate further. But in this moment, it's her diner, her fight, and she knows she has to take control. Then let them watch, Emma says, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. If doing the right thing makes me a target, so be it. But I won't stand down just because someone says I should. The man stares at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, something shifts in his demeanor, his shoulders slump just slightly, the fire in his eyes dimming. He straightens up, glancing around the room as if seeing it for the first time. The bikers outside, the overturned table, the shattered dishes, it all seems to sink in. "You're brave," he mutters, almost to himself. "Stupid, maybe, but brave." Before anyone can respond, he moves toward the door in quick, jerky motions. Bear tenses, his eyes narrowing, but the man raises a hand as if to signal he's done fighting. "You'll see," he says cryptically over his shoulder. "This isn't over." The doorbell chimes faintly as he exits, and the diner's interior plunges into an uneasy silence. Emma exhales, only now realizing she's been holding her breath. The weight of the man's words hangs heavily in the air, mixing with the scent of burnt coffee and the faint grease of frying pans. Bear places a steadying hand on her shoulder, his voice low. "You all right?" Emma nods, though the tension in her chest doesn't abate. Her eyes drift to the window, where she can see the man weaving through the bikers outside. He doesn't stop, barely looking at them as he makes his way down the road and disappears into the distance. The bikers exchange glances but don't pursue him, their attention turning back toward the diner. "Who was he?" Tony asks, breaking the heavy silence. "I don't know," Emma admits, "but he's not the first, and he won't be the last." The truth of her words settles over the group like a cold shadow. Outside, the faint sound of engines revving signals that some of the bikers are preparing to leave, their faces set in determined expressions. Inside, Emma begins to pick up the broken pieces of her diner, literally and figuratively. She doesn't know what's coming next, but she can feel the pull of whatever forces she's unwittingly challenged tightening around her. And just as her ragged nerves begin to steady, the phone rings again, a sharp, piercing sound that cuts through the room, stopping everyone in their tracks. Emma freezes, her hand hovering over a broken coffee cup. The bikers nearest to the counter exchange tense looks, and Bear steps closer to the phone, his gaze flicking to Emma. "Answer it," he says gravely. "Let's see who's calling this time." The sound of the phone rings sharp and insistent, cutting through the tense silence that has settled over the diner. Every eye is on Emma as she takes an uneasy step toward the counter. Her hand trembles slightly as she lifts the receiver, her knuckles tightening around it like a lifeline. "Reed's Diner," she says, her voice steady but taut, betraying the storm churning inside her. There's a pause. For a fleeting moment, she hears nothing but static, a faint hum that crawls under her skin and makes the pounding of her heart seem deafening. And then, a voice, low, gravelly, and laced with an icy calm that feels far more menacing than any shouted threat. "It's not over yet," the voice says. "You might want to start thinking about who you're putting at risk." Emma clenches her teeth, her spine stiffening. "Who is this?" she demands, though deep down she knows she won't get a straight answer. Whoever is on the other line isn't interested in explaining themselves. They want to unsettle her, to remind her that the shadows she's stepped into are bigger and darker than she can imagine. Instead of answering, the voice delivers one final, chilling line. "Eyes are everywhere, Miss Reed. Be careful where you look next." The line goes dead. Emma lowers the phone slowly, the receiver slipping from her grasp for a fraction of a second before she catches it. The sharp clack as she places it back on the cradle sends an unintentional signal to the bikers outside that something is wrong. She turns toward the door, her face pale but set with determination. Bear is the first to meet her eyes as the group begins to file in behind him. He crosses the room in long strides, towering over her with a quiet authority that somehow feels reassuring. "What happened?" he asks, though the hard edge in his voice makes it clear he's already bracing for the answer. Emma exhales, rubbing a hand over her forehead as if trying to erase the weight of the past 24 hours. "Another call," she admits. "Someone's watching, or so they want me to think. They didn't say who they were, just that what happened isn't over." Tony steps up beside Bear, his usual calm shaken ever so slightly by the flicker of worry in his gaze. "What do they want from you, Emma?" You didn't do anything wrong? She shakes her head, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as if it might shield her from the unease creeping closer with every second. It's not about what I've done, she says. It's about standing up to them. Whoever's behind this, they don't like being challenged, especially not by someone like me, a diner waitress in a small town. Bear runs a hand through his graying ponytail, his jaw visibly tightening. They picked the wrong person to mess with, he mutters, more to himself than anyone else. Then, louder, Emma, we're not going anywhere. You've got 100 bikers outside who aren't just here for pancakes and coffee. We're here for you. There's a quiet murmur of agreement from the others, their leather vests creaking as they shift uneasily in the small confines of the diner. Emma looks at each of their faces, different stories and lives stitched into every wrinkle, scar, and patch they wear. It's as though a part of her finally realizes the magnitude of what she's stumbled into. She hasn't just allied herself with Tony, she's allied herself with all of them, the entire brotherhood, their code, their unwavering sense of loyalty, and their readiness to go to war if called upon. Sandy, still clutching the coffee pot, clears her throat nervously from behind the counter. Emma, she says cautiously, her eyes darting between the bikers and her boss, what if they're serious? What if this doesn't end until something happens? Before Emma can respond, Tony places a hand on the counter and leans forward slightly, addressing Sandy directly but loud enough for everyone to hear. Then it won't happen to her alone, he vows, his voice firm and steady. If something's coming, we'll face it head on. Together. The bikers nod in unison, the weight of their collective resolve seeping into the room like the steady heat of a fire. Emma swallows hard, a surge of gratitude mingling with the fear still clawing at her insides. For a moment, she feels torn between the courage they're offering her and the undeniable anxiety of what's brewing on the horizon. The sound of approaching footsteps breaks her train of thought. One of the younger bikers peers in through the front window before stepping inside, his face flushed and his expression grim. You're gonna want to see this, he says, addressing no one in particular but looking directly at Bear. The group follows him outside, the sharp chill of the late afternoon air biting at their faces as they step into the parking lot. At first, Emma doesn't see anything amiss, just the sea of bikes still lined up like a leather-clad army waiting for orders. But then her eyes land on the far side of the lot, where a sleek black car is parked at an angle that gives it a perfect view of the diner. Inside, two figures sit still as statues, their faces obscured by the tinted glass, but their intent as clear as daylight. They're watching. Looks like our friend on the phone has backup, Bear says grimly, narrowing his eyes at the car. He takes a single step forward, and the engine roars to life as though startled by his presence. The car peels out of the lot, leaving behind a cloud of dust and tire marks burned into the asphalt. Emma watches it disappear, her stomach churning. They're not just watching me, she says quietly. They're watching all of us. Bear glances back at her, his expression firm but reassuring. Good. Let them watch, he says. They'll see what happens when they push too far. The chill of the evening air brushed against Emma's skin as she stood on the diner steps once again, staring uneasily at the glimmering tire marks left on the asphalt where the black car had been. The distant hum of conversations among the bikers was low and heavy, their voices tinged with quiet resolve. She couldn't help but wonder what was truly coming next and whether they were all prepared for it. Inside the diner, the warmth from the faintly glowing neon open sign seemed at odds with the cool tension in the air. Emma's mind raced as she tidied up behind the counter. Dishes stacked from earlier, coffee pots cleaned, but her hands weren't moving with their usual fluidity. She was distracted, her thoughts spiraling back to the earlier phone call and that ominous black car. Whatever game was being played, she was sure it was anything but small. Bear stepped inside, his boots scraping against the tiled floor. His towering presence was a mixture of calm steadiness and a barely contained energy, like a storm cloud holding back the rain. Get any rest last night? He asked, leaning casually against the counter. His tone might have been nonchalant, but his eyes searched her face for any cracks in her composure. Emma offered a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Does it look like I did? She replied, trying to inject some lightness into her voice. Bear grunted, not amused. Well, he began tentatively, you're not in this alone. I hope you know that by now. I do, she said. She sounded more resolute than she felt. But the truth was, knowing the bikers had her back wasn't enough to erase the sense of dread that had crept into her bones. Just then, Tony appeared at the door, his figure silhouetted against the deepening twilight. He carried a few folded papers under his arm, but his face betrayed something more serious than the errands they likely involved. Stepping inside and offering Emma a polite nod, Tony placed the papers on the counter next to a freshly wiped-down placemat. "What's that?" Emma asked, her curiosity piqued. Tony hesitated briefly before explaining. "Info about the officers who were here yesterday and some of the other names we think might be involved." His voice was measured, careful. "I had some guys do a little digging, and it seems this thing goes deeper than just local harassment." Emma frowned, her gut tightening. "How deep?" "Deep enough," Tony replied vaguely. "Deep enough for us to need to tread carefully." Bear took one of the papers and scanned it, his expression darkening as he read. "This," he said gruffly, motioning toward the document, "this isn't small-town politics. There's pressure coming from outside, from people who have no reason to care about this place except—" He let the sentence hang. "Except what?" Emma pressed. Bear exhaled, setting the paper back down with a slight edge of frustration. "Except that they're protecting something or someone a lot more valuable to them than whether or not we stand up to their bullying." Emma's curiosity warred with her anxiety. Knowing more felt like peeling back the layers of an onion. Each layer brought tears and discomfort, but also a glimpse of the core truth, and she wasn't sure how much more of that truth she wanted to see. More bikers were starting to gather outside. Some looked like they had no intention of leaving soon, while others seemed defensive, glancing toward the darkening horizon as though waiting for an ambush. Emma glanced at one particularly young biker leaning against a parked bike. He couldn't have been older than 22, barely more than a kid. Did he understand what he was signing up for? Did any of them? Her musing was interrupted by the shrill jingle of her cell phone vibrating on the shelf near the register. Emma snatched it up but quickly felt her stomach drop when she saw the no-caller ID flashing on the screen. Her fingers hesitated over the answer button before Bear's voice, calm but firm, broke through her hesitation. "Answer it," he said again. The solidness of his gaze passed a strange sort of reassurance her way. Slowly, Emma pressed the green button on the screen and brought the phone to her ear, her heartbeat drumming just slightly faster than normal. "Miss Reed," the voice greeted her, alarmingly casual this time. Not gravelly and detached like the other call, but smoother. A calculated familiarity that felt like cold steel dressed in a velvet glove. "I see you've been keeping busy." Emma inhaled deeply but kept the quaver out of her voice. "And I see you've been keeping tabs on me. Haven't your people got better things to do?" A pause, then a low chuckle. "Oh, I admire your courage. I really do. But trust me when I tell you, this isn't your fight to win. Walk away. Shut the diner down for a week. Take a vacation. Pretend you've never heard of Tony or Bear or whoever else has drawn you into their world. You'll thank me later." Bear tensed visibly, straining to hear the voice over the silence. Emma, now beyond anger, clenched her jaw in defiance. "Thanks for the advice," she snapped. "You can pass that same message along to whoever thinks they can scare us off." "Us," the voice repeated. "Isn't it funny how people like you always seem to band together right before it all falls apart? I'll say this one last time, Miss Reed. Loyalty has costs. Be sure you're willing to pay them." And just like before, the line went dead. Emma dropped her hand from the phone slowly, the weight of the call settling over her like a lead blanket. She relayed the conversation quickly to Bear, her words measured but clear. Both men exchanged grim looks, Tony's quiet demeanor breaking slightly as his lips pressed into a hard line. Outside, the distant thrum of engines reverberated through the night air, faint but nearing. Emma's spine stiffened as she caught the sound, a stark reminder that whatever lines had been drawn were now under threat. Tony moved toward the window, his body taut with anticipation. "They're here," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. All eyes turned toward the road, where the glow of approaching headlights pierced through the growing twilight. The shadows of the unknown were no longer distant. They were almost at the doorstep. The tension outside the diner lingers like smoke from an extinguished fire, heavy and oppressive as the distant roar of engines grows louder. Emma moves to stand near the doorway, her hands gripping the frame for support. Her heart races not from fear, but from the charged electric anticipation running through her veins. The glow of incoming headlights cuts through the dark horizon, slicing across the gathered bikers and forcing them to tense in response. Bear steps out of the diner and onto the lot, his silhouette dark and unshakable against the encroaching lights. His voice carries over the murmur of the assembled riders, commanding and firm. Everyone stay exactly where you are. Let's see who it is first. The bikers quiet down, their instincts primed. All eyes turn toward the incoming caravan. The first of the motorcycles emerges from the gloom, its polished chrome catching the faint streetlights. More follow in a staggered formation, 5, 6, 7 riders at least, all bearing an unfamiliar insignia on their jackets. They park their bikes in a loose cluster just shy of the diner's perimeter. A palpable wave of unease rolls through the gathered bikers. This isn't one of theirs. These newcomers hold themselves with a calculated air, their movements deliberate and their faces unreadable. The largest of them dismounts first, his towering presence suggesting authority. His leather vest is adorned with sigils that seem vaguely ominous, a wolf's head encircled by barbed wire. His steel-gray eyes scan the lot before settling on Bear. The lead biker steps forward, his boots crunching on loose gravel. He stops a few feet from Bear, close enough to match him in stature, but leaving a space that seems more confrontational than respectful. Bear, isn't it? His voice is quiet but weighty, each word landing like a dropped stone. Bear crosses his arms over his chest, unfazed. You're on our turf. Got a reason for being here? The man's lips twist into a smirk, though it doesn't quite reach his eyes. Call me Garrett. Let's say I heard about your little gathering here. Didn't want to miss the party. His tone is cool, almost mocking, and his expression suggests he's enjoying the tension he's causing. Tony steps up beside Bear, his presence steadier than it's been all day. Say what you came to say, he says curtly, cutting through Garrett's theatrics. We don't have time for games. Garrett's eyes flick to Tony, sizing him up for a beat before responding. I like a man who gets to the point. He gestures vaguely toward the diner and the riders surrounding it. But here's the thing. You're poking at a hornet's nest you don't understand. This thing you're playing at? It doesn't end well for anyone. Emma, still standing in the doorway, feels her chest tighten. She steps forward, the gravel crunching under her shoes as she crosses the threshold. I'm the one who stood up, she says, her voice steadier than she expected. If you have something to say it to me. Garrett turns his gaze on her, the steel gray piercing hers with an intensity that feels like a spotlight. For a moment, the air seems to still, the weight of his attention suffocating. Then he smiles, a thin, razor-sharp smile that carries more menace than friendliness. You're braver than I expected, Emma Reed. I can see why they're rallying around you. Cut the theatrics, Bear growls, stepping forward to block Garrett's line of sight. If you've got a point, make it. Otherwise, turn around and ride out of here. Garrett chuckles softly, brushing invisible dust off his jacket. The point is, this isn't your fight, he says, directing his words over Bear's shoulder and straight to Emma. The people you're protecting, they're not worth what's coming. And if you keep pushing, all you'll do is burn yourself down with them. Emma's jaw tightens. Every rational part of her tells her to stay quiet, to not provoke the man who's clearly playing a bigger game. But she takes a step forward, her hands trembling less now than before. I don't care what threats you bring. All I did was stand up for what's right. And I'd do it again. So maybe you should ask yourself what kind of person that makes you whoever you're protecting. The tension snaps taut, and for a moment, even the distant sounds of the highway seem to fade. Garrett's smirk dissolves, his face hardening into something more primal. You have no idea what you've just stepped into, he says, his tone dropping into something dangerous. But maybe you need a demonstration. Before anyone can react, Garrett snaps his fingers and two of his riders step forward, reaching for one of the parked Harleys. They upend it onto its side with a horrible crunch of metal on asphalt. The assembled bikers erupt, voices rising in anger and protest. But Bear raises a hand, silencing them. His eyes are locked on Garrett, unblinking. You made your point, Bear says, his voice low but carrying a dangerous edge. Now get out. Garrett holds his ground for a moment, the tension between him and Bear like a live wire. Then he nods slowly, as if conceding some unspoken challenge. Enjoy your little stand while it lasts, he says, turning back toward his bike. We'll be seeing you all real soon. The sound of engines firing up signals their departure, but the weight they leave behind hangs heavy in the air. Emma exhales sharply, her hands gripping her sides to stop from shaking. Tony steps closer, his expression tight. This doesn't feel like it's going to blow over. Bear nods grimly, his hand clenching into a fist. It won't. And to them, that was just the opening move. Emma looks at the toppled bike, the shattered glass glinting under the parking lot lights. The reality of the fight ahead crystallizes in that moment. There's no going back now. And as the sound of Garrett's crew fades into the night, the distant wail of sirens echoes once again, promising that the storm is far from over. As the piercing sound of sirens grows louder, Emma feels her pulse quicken yet again. The lights in the diner flicker faintly as though the universe itself feels the tension, and outside, the bikers instantly form a tighter formation. It's not panic, not this group, they've faced these odds before, but there's an undeniable current of unease, a collective understanding that this night could escalate in ways no one is truly prepared for. Bear is already walking toward the edge of the lot, his broad figure silhouetted against the bouncing red and blue strobes that now reflect off the rows of parked motorcycles. His head lifts slightly as he squints into the oncoming squad cars, his calm demeanor somehow commanding the same quiet from those gathered behind him. Nobody moves except for Tony, who steps up and stands just a half step behind Bear. It's clear this is not just loyalty, it's family at his side. The first squad car comes to a halt just outside the diner's parking lot boundary, crunching the gravel beneath its tires. Shutting off its engine, it sits there for a moment, menacing like a beast waiting to pounce. The second vehicle pulls in behind it, but the officers make no immediate move to step out, heightening the suspense. Emma finds herself gripping the diner's doorframe so tightly that her knuckles turn white. The weight of the situation hangs heavy in the air. Finally, the driver's door of the first car swings open, revealing the same senior officer from earlier. The tall, weathered-faced man who had spoken to her with thinly veiled threats. His boots crunch against the ground as he steps out. This time, his hand rests not casually, but surely on the firearm strapped to his side. Following him, the younger officer from before emerges, his features pinched with a mixture of unease and misplaced confidence. The distinction between them is clear. The senior officer knows exactly what's about to happen, while the younger one hasn't yet learned to mask his own apprehensions. "Evening," the older man says, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone who's done this dance too many times to count. His eyes scan the lot, the ranks of bikers like statues. He looks past Emma, lingering on the diner itself, before his gaze locks onto Bear. "Thought I'd find you here." Bear steps forward, closing the distance without hesitation but not enough to overtly threaten. His voice is steady as he replies, "We tend to stick together, officer, something you probably figured out by now." The officer smirks faintly but without humor. "Oh, I don't need to figure it out. I know exactly who you are, Bear and the rest of these folks too." He nods slightly toward the gathered bikers. "You think numbers make you untouchable? That you can circle the wagons and nobody'll push back?" His tone sharpens, his words slicing through the cool night air. "This isn't a protest. This isn't a playground rally, and this town still abides by the law." "The law?" Tony's voice cuts through the standoff before Bear can respond, his words coming sharper than usual. He steps forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with his cousin. "You mean like harassing people at diners without cause? Like pushing around anyone wearing a leather jacket because it makes your life easier? That kind of law?" The younger officer shifts uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Tony and the group of bikers, but the senior officer's demeanor doesn't so much as flinch. Instead, he sighs as though tired of dealing with children. "Don't try to make this about principles. This is about keeping the peace, a peace you all seem determined to shatter." Emma can't stay silent any longer. She steps away from the diner's entrance, her voice clear and bold, though her chest feels tighter with every word. "We wouldn't have to stand together if peace was what you actually wanted. What happened in this diner wasn't about law and order, it was intimidation, plain and simple. If you expected us to just forget it, then you underestimated all of us." Her words carry over the parking lot like a crack of thunder, silencing even the faint murmurs of the assembled bikers. The officer's gaze shifts to her now, a predator sizing up the prey that suddenly refuses to run. His smile doesn't reach his eyes as he speaks. "Spirited as ever, Miss Reed, I'll give you that. But principles don't pay much when you're face down in the dirt, and you're all about to learn just how unforgiving this town can be." The vague but chilling threat sends a murmur rippling through the bikers, but none of them move forward, not yet. Bear's voice rumbles low as he takes half a step closer, his sheer presence enough to halt the officer's next words. "If you're here to rile us up, keep talking," Bear says. "But if you're planning something, you'd better think real hard about what your next move is going to be. We don't start fights, but we sure as hell know how to finish them." For the first time, there's a flicker of hesitation in the officer's sharp, unflinching gaze, just enough to show he's taking the warning seriously. But before anyone can escalate further, a third car pulls up to the scene, its sleek black frame instantly recognizable even in the dim light. It's the same car that lingered outside hours ago, the one with the watchers. When its driver's door swings open, the weight of uncertainty crashes like a tidal wave. A man in a tailored suit steps out, his movements smooth and deliberate. His face, sharp-jawed and coldly handsome, looks utterly out of place amidst the gravel and grease of the parking lot. He adjusts his cuffs with an air of disinterest, though his calculated steps indicate he's well in control of this new development. He says nothing at first, letting the tension stretch paper-thin as he regards the bikers, the diner, and finally, the officers. "Gentlemen," he begins, his voice a quiet command that freezes the lot in place. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately." He glances at Emma then, his expression unreadable before shifting back to the officers. No need to sour the evening with unnecessary theatrics. The cliffhanger lands with an audible silence, the kind where everyone seems to hold their breath. Whatever game has begun is far from over, and the question that lingers now isn't if it will erupt, but when. The bikers stood silent, their bodies rigid as the suited man's presence slithered through the parking lot like an invasive fog. The tailored man radiated an authority that didn't come from physical size or bravado. It was in the deliberate way he moved, the tangibly sharp calmness he commanded. Emma felt a sinking unease settle in her gut. Whatever force he represented, it was bigger than a simple small-town problem. Bear watched the suit with the same wary stillness as a guard dog deciding whether to bark or bite. He didn't give the man the satisfaction of a greeting or acknowledgement, instead remaining a solid wall between him and the crowd. The officer, complacent moments ago, now hesitated, waiting for the man in the suit to speak further. "Miss Reed?" The suit began casually, his sharp features turning toward Emma as if she were the only person present. His voice, smooth and almost gentle, carried weight impossible to ignore. "First, allow me to commend your courage. It's not often someone like you shakes the tree this much, but I'm afraid the fruit you've stirred loose isn't something you'll want on your plate." His smile was polite, shaved too thin to be warm. Emma's chest rose and fell steadily, but it was a deliberate effort to maintain her composure. She wasn't about to let this stranger trying to reduce her resolve with practiced words, intimidate her into silence. "And what exactly does someone like me mean, Mr.?" She left the question dangling deliberately, folding her arms to keep them from trembling. "Call me Laurent," the man offered, his tone syrupy with cordiality. "And someone like you? It's not an insult. It's a compliment, albeit a rare one. You have conviction, Emma Reed, more than most people, and it's a quality I always find so fascinating. But your conviction is leading you down a dangerous path." Bear stepped forward, his towering figure attracting Laurent's attention like a magnet. "She's not walking any path alone," Bear said evenly, his voice a gravelly warning. "And you'd better believe this group isn't going to move just because you've shown up with a shiny suit and a couple of big words. So whatever you're trying to sell, take it somewhere else." Laurent studied Bear for a moment, undisturbed by the looming hostility directed his way. "Ah, Bear," he said, tilting his head slightly as though he were flipping through mental pages like a Rolodex. "I've read quite a bit about you. You've worn many hats in your life, some more legal than others. Impressive resume for a man your age." The comment prickled, but Bear didn't flinch. Emma, though rattled, couldn't help but feel a flicker of admiration for the restraint he maintained, even with every provocation aimed directly at him. "Whatever you think you know," Bear said, his voice low and rumbling, "you're wasting your time if you think it'll make a difference here." Laurent smiled faintly, ignoring Bear's words as he turned his attention back to Emma. "You see, Miss Reed, my associates employed the officers earlier not to apply brute force, no. That's not our preferred method, but as a litmus test. And, well, you've presented us with quite the unexpected scenario. This display of defiance," he gestured briefly at the line of bikers, "it complicates things." "Good," Emma replied firmly, surprising even herself with the steel in her tone. "Maybe things should be complicated when people are being harassed for no reason. Maybe that's better than sweeping it under the rug." Laurent studied her for a long moment before his head inclined slightly. "Perhaps," he admitted, "but complexity, dear Emma, often carries unintended consequences. Is your diner worth it? Are your employees? Your friends?" "That very conviction I admire. It puts a target on more than just your own back." The subtle threat in his words left no room for misinterpretation. Bear stiffened, his patience nearing its limit while Tony finally broke his silence, stepping forward. Get to the point, he demanded. For the first time, Laurent let his expression slip, a chill cutting through his previously pleasant demeanor like frost creeping across glass. The point? The point is simply this. Leave it alone. Tell your bikers to go home. Run your diner, pour your coffee, flip your burgers. Let these matters resolve themselves. Emma's breath caught in her throat, confusion clouded by anger. You mean crawl back into the shadows and shut up? Pretend nothing happened. Pretend the harassment, the threats, they're just a normal part of life. That's your solution? Laurent's eyes sharpened, and for a moment, the practiced diplomat mask slipped, revealing something rawer underneath. It's your only solution, he said, his tone almost a whisper, velvet-wrapped steel. You keep this up, and I guarantee you'll wish you had taken this warning more seriously. Is that a promise? Bear asked, his voice a growing growl beneath Laurent's threats. It's a courtesy, Laurent shot back, composure regained, turning on his heel. But just as he began striding toward his car, the sound of tires screeching on asphalt split through the tension like a blade. Heads turned sharply as another vehicle sped into the parking lot, stopping abruptly with a jolt. Out stepped a woman in plain clothing, her hair drawn back into a no-nonsense ponytail and a badge hooked onto her belt, an FBI agent. She didn't glance at the bikers or the officers lingering tensely. Her gaze zeroed in on Laurent, the sharp edge of authority unmatched even by him. Laurent, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, her tone clipped and professional. You're leaving. Now. No one moved as Laurent turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Agent Farrell, he mused, tipping an invisible hat. Always a pleasure. The agent stepped forward, her stance military precise, unwavering. Get in your car and drive off before this gets added to your growing list of infractions. And take your scare tactics with you. We'll have a conversation soon, but not tonight. Laurent's smile flickered dangerously before solidifying into something polite but empty. Of course, he said, brushing non-existent dust from his lapel. Without another word, he climbed into his car. The sleek vehicle growled to life and disappeared into the shadows beyond the lot. Emma exhaled deeply but knew the reprieve was temporary. Laurent wasn't done, and neither was she. The hum of tense silence persisted in the diner as Agent Farrell drove away, her taillights swallowed by the shroud of night. No one spoke immediately, the weight of Laurent's presence and his cryptic threats still lingering in the air. Emma felt the eyes of her allies on her, the bikers restless for answers, for meaning to the sudden escalation that seemed to have erupted around her diner like a wildfire. Bear paced across the floor, his boots thudding heavily against the tiles. That suit, Laurent, he said at last, turning to Tony and Emma with burning intensity in his eyes. He's not just some middleman. Did you hear him? Talking about litmus tests, about this fight being bigger? He's playing us like pawns in some bigger chess game. Emma leaned against the counter for support, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Bear's words didn't shock her, they confirmed what she had suspected ever since Laurent first walked into the diner. But a confirmation didn't make carrying the weight of it any easier. And he thinks I'll cave, she muttered, shaking her head. That will all scatter like frightened mice if they push hard enough. Tony sat at one of the stools near the counter, rubbing his jaw thoughtfully. He singled you out for a reason, he said, more than being the one to stand up to those officers in the first place. His tone suggested he understood far more than he was willing to say out loud. Maybe, Emma admitted, her voice carrying a distant and tired quality, but I'm not sure why yet. I'm just a small-town waitress with bills to pay and a family recipe for apple pie. I don't have secrets, Tony. I don't have anything they'd want. Bear stopped pacing and turned sharply toward her, his eyes narrowing. You have visibility now, he said, almost accusingly. You've got everyone in this town talking. You've got us. He gestured to the sea of leather-clad bikers outside, showing up in numbers that make people nervous. You might not think you have anything to offer, but you're a damn symbol now, and symbols are a whole lot harder to crush than a single person. Emma wanted to argue, to point out how absurd it felt that her life had shifted so drastically in such a short span of time. But she couldn't. Deep down, she knew Bear was right. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about what her actions represented. Someone standing firm when it mattered most. The soft jingle of the diner's door interrupted her thoughts. A young biker, one of the newer recruits, barely out of his teens by the look of him, stepped inside and shuffled nervously toward the group. His jacket hung awkwardly over his slim frame, and his voice cracked slightly as he spoke. Bear, Tony, you guys might want to come outside. There's something you should see. All three of them exchanged wary glances before following the young man to the door. As they stepped out into the night, the faint but unmistakable scent of burning rubber and oil wafted through the parking lot. The other bikers had gathered closer to the far edge of the lot, their voices low but urgent as they stared at something just out of sight. Bear pushed his way through, Emma and Tony right behind him. What they saw sent a chill rippling through the crowd. Parked just beyond the boundary of the diner's lot was a row of vehicles, cars and motorcycles alike, with no visible occupants. But the unmistakable shimmer of their engines hinted that they hadn't parked long. The vehicles bore no decals, no markings of affiliation. Yet the sheer number of them, lined like chess pieces waiting to be moved, carried one unmistakable message. The night wouldn't remain peaceful for long. "This is coordinated," Tony muttered, his voice barely audible over the murmurs of concern surrounding them. "They're not just watching now, they're making sure we see them." Bear's jaw tightened and his fists clenched at his sides. "They're baiting us, trying to rile us up so we make the first move." Then, louder to the gathered riders, "Nobody touches those vehicles, you hear me? Stand down and stay put." The bikers exchanged tense glances but obeyed their elder's command, falling into a tight formation around the lot instead of advancing on the unmarked vehicles. Emma felt her throat tighten, her instincts screaming at her to demand someone explain why this was happening. But she knew better than to let fear show. "We can't just wait for them to make the next move," she said, turning to Bear. "They're not going to just go away." She gestured toward the mysterious line of cars. "They want some kind of reaction." Bear nodded grimly. "And we're not going to give it to them not like this." Before Emma could process his words, the low thrum of another engine broke the silence. A single car, sleek, black, and all too familiar, pulled into view from the empty road ahead. It rolled to a slow stop, its windows reflecting the diner's glowing neon sign. When the driver's side door opened, Emma's heart skipped a beat. Laurent stepped out, his expression wary yet composed as he stood under the faint glow of a street lamp. He held up his hands in mock surrender, his voice cutting through the tense night air with disarming ease. "I thought we might have a conversation without all the theatrics," he called out, the faint trace of a smirk ghosting over his lips. "May I?" Bear stepped forward, positioning himself between Laurent and the gathered crowd. "Say your piece from there," he growled. "We're not interested in games." Laurent chuckled softly but didn't advance. "You misunderstand," he said smoothly. "I'm not here to intimidate, quite the opposite, in fact. I'm here to offer you all an opportunity." His gaze swept across the assembled bikers, lingering briefly on Emma. "An opportunity to end this on your terms before anyone gets hurt." The tension around Emma thickened, her heartbeat quickening. Laurent's measured words felt like the beginning of something much worse than simple intimidation. And for the first time, she wondered if courage might not be enough to see them through this storm. The roar of motorcycles faded into the night, leaving Emma and the remaining bikers standing in a tense circle by the diner. The confrontation with Laurent and his cryptic warnings still hung in the air like a lingering storm cloud. Every word he spoke replayed in her mind as if etched there, driving home the reality of what they were truly up against. It wasn't just local cops harassing Tony or a diner that stood up for its principles. This was bigger, wider-reaching, and far more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. Bear stood firm at the edge of the lot, his sharp eyes scanning the rows of bikes and the empty road beyond. His presence was steady, even reassuring, but Emma could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. Tony was close by, his fingers wrapped tightly around the edges of his leather vest as he exchanged hushed words with a couple of riders. Meanwhile, Emma wandered back toward the diner, her thoughts scattered like broken glass. She paused before stepping inside, taking a long, measured breath before asking herself the same question yet again. How had it come to this? A moment's decision to stand against injustice had unleashed a cascade of events that now felt unstoppable. Inside, the diner was unnaturally quiet. Sandy and a few other staff stood awkwardly behind the counter, clearly shaken by the escalating tension that seemed to pulse through the walls. The warm aroma of coffee and fried food, once comforting, now hung thick and heavy in the air. Emma moved behind the counter, touching her hand to an empty coffee pot as if to anchor herself. "Emma," Sandy said hesitantly, her voice trembling, What if they come back, or worse? Do you think—" She didn't finish the thought, but it was clear where her fears led. Emma turned to her, her expression softening despite her own worries. "We've got people out there who won't let anything happen. And we're not alone in this, Sandy. That's more than most people have when they're pushed into a corner like this. Sandy nodded, though her fear was still evident. Emma didn't blame her. She couldn't even blame herself for quietly sharing that fear. The threats from Laurent, the dangerous weight of his cool demeanor, lingered in her mind like smoke in her lungs. Laurent had made it clear that this fight wasn't about laws or justice. It was about power and punishment for anyone who dared to stand in the way. And now, Emma wasn't just in the way, she was the target. Outside, the sound of boots crunching against gravel drew her attention. Bear and Tony stepped back into the diner, their figures crowding the small doorway as they brought the tension with them inside. The low murmur of bikers outside had died down, replaced with watchful silence, as if the group was collectively holding its breath. "We've got eyes on us," Bear said without preamble. His voice was low, not wanting the staff to hear more than they needed to. "Those vehicles haven't moved, but I don't trust they're empty. They're watching, waiting for an excuse. Probably Laurent's people, making sure the message is delivered loud and clear." "What message?" Emma asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Tony sighed, running a hand over his face. "That we're outmatched. That we should back off before it gets messy." "But we're not backing off," Bear interjected firmly, meeting Emma's eyes. "He underestimates what it means to stand up when others can't, when they won't. People like Laurent don't respect principles, but they sure as hell fear them when they start spreading. That's why he's pushing so hard now." Emma nodded slowly. Deep down, she knew Bear was right. This wasn't about breaking her resolve anymore. This was about sending a message to anyone bold enough to follow her lead. The problem was, messages like that didn't come without collateral damage. A sudden thud from behind the diner snapped everyone's attention. Bear and Tony were immediately alert, their movements sharp and calculated as they grabbed the door handle leading to the back lot. Emma froze in place, her heart pounding as she watched them disappear outside. Moments stretched into eternity, the thick silence inside the diner amplifying every distant noise. When they returned, Tony carried a crumpled piece of paper in his hand, his face tight with restrained anger. "Whoever it was didn't stick around," he said curtly. Bear motioned for Emma to join them. Reluctantly, she stepped forward, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes on her. She took the note from Tony, her fingers brushing against the cool, rough paper. Unfolding it, she felt her stomach drop as she read the stark, chilling words written in bold black ink. "This is your final warning." No signature, no indication of who left it, but Emma didn't need to guess. It was Laurent's hand, or at least someone working for him. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment threat, it was calculated, deliberate, and terrifying in its simplicity. Bear was already speaking, his tone clipped with anger. "Enough dancing around, it's time we take this to them before they have the chance to pull whatever stunt they're planning. We wait too long, and they'll box us in, not just legally but physically." Emma's voice wavered slightly as she spoke. "And if it escalates? If someone gets hurt?" Bear looked at her, his gaze firm but not unemotional. "People are already hurt, Emma. Every time someone gets scared into staying silent, every time someone like Tony gets singled out for what he wears or where he's from, we're taking hits nobody can see. The difference is, now we're hitting back." The words hung in the air, both comforting and ominous. Emma looked down at the note again, her mind racing. She thought back to the day before, to the moment when her courage had first ignited this chain of events. She hadn't planned for any of this, but planning didn't seem to matter anymore. Before she could reply, the jarring ring of the diner's phone cut through the heavy silence. Sandy gasped audibly as all eyes turned toward the ringing phone. Emma's heart jumped. Every instinct screamed at her to leave it alone, but she forced herself forward, her hand trembling ever so slightly as she picked up the receiver. "Reed's Diner?" she said cautiously, her voice barely above a whisper. A pause. Then, the same polished, maddeningly smooth voice from before. "Miss Reed, I trust you received my message?" Emma's hands tightened around the phone. Her voice came out steady, even as her insides churned. "I received it. Care to explain what happens if I don't comply?" A soft chuckle rolled through the line, low and patient, like a predator toying with its prey. "Let's just say, you won't be the only one paying the price. Think carefully before you respond, Miss Reed. Time's running out." The line went dead, leaving Emma gripping the receiver as if it could somehow hold all the answers she needed. The room felt colder, the faces of her allies sharper in their concern. And as she set the phone back down, she realized there was no going back now. Whatever fight she had stepped into, she was in it until the very end. The sound of the diner's door echoed faintly, a soft metallic jingle against the backdrop of tense silence. Emma stood motionless behind the counter, the phone still in her hand as if it might explain the chilling conversation she'd just had. Laurent's final words remained heavy in her mind. "You won't be the only one paying the price." She tried to focus on the room around her, but her thoughts moved sluggishly, weighed down by fear and the enormity of it all. Bear's voice cut through the stillness, low and deliberate. "What did he say?" he asked. He and Tony stood near the counter, their imposing figures shadowed in the dim glow of the diner's lights. There was no patience in his tone, only focus. Whatever message Laurent had delivered, Bear understood it wasn't one they could ignore. Emma lowered the receiver into its cradle and met Bear's gaze. Her voice, though shaky, carried the determination they had come to expect from her. "He said I should think carefully about my next move, that it wouldn't just be me facing the consequences." Tony rested his hands on the counter, his brow furrowed deeply. "Coward," he muttered through clenched teeth. "He won't show his hand, but he wants us to make a mistake first." Emma nodded slowly, her mind racing. "It's more than that. He's not just trying to intimidate us, he's preparing for something. Something bigger than just a warning." Bear glanced over his shoulder at the crowd of bikers still gathered outside under the cold light of the parking lot's solitary lamp. He exhaled sharply, his breath steaming in the cool night air that slipped into the diner. "Emma's right," he said. "Laurent isn't bluffing. He's making sure we know he's in control, even if we don't see the full picture yet." "Then what do we do?" Sandy's voice, barely above a whisper, came from where she and the other staff stood, huddled by the kitchen door. Though they tried to appear calm, their wide eyes and stiff postures betrayed their fear. For Sandy and the others, this wasn't bravery or strategy. It was survival, plain and simple. Emma straightened her shoulders, willing herself to project a steadiness she wasn't sure she felt. "We stay vigilant," she said firmly. "We don't give him the reaction he's looking for, and we don't let fear make the decisions for us." Easier said than done. Outside, the parked vehicles. The unmarked cars and motorcycles Laurent's unseen forces had stationed like predators, waiting to pounce, served as an ever-present reminder of the threat looming over them. The bikers had obeyed Bear's earlier command to hold their ground, but Emma could feel their frustration simmering, just beneath the surface. Each one of them was ready for a fight, and the tension stretched like a taut wire waiting to snap. Tony, leaning against the counter, glanced toward Bear and then back at Emma. "I'll patrol the perimeter," he said. "If they're planning anything tonight, we'll know." Bear nodded, though he didn't look comforted by the reassurance. "Take two with you," he instructed simply. "No one goes alone." Tony stepped outside, relaying the instructions to a pair of bikers who quickly fell in line. Their footsteps crunched against the gravel as they disappeared into the darkness, and for a brief moment, Emma felt the diner's walls closing in. Every sound, every faint hum of an engine, every metallic clink as the bikers adjusted their gear, every muffled word seemed amplified in the still night. From behind the counter, Sandy called out hesitantly, "Emma, should we close up for the night?" Her voice trembled, clearly hoping for a yes. None of the other staff spoke, but their expressions mirrored her uncertainty. Emma hesitated, glancing back at Bear. She hated the idea of shutting the diner down, of giving in to the fear that Laurent and his people had so expertly instilled. But she couldn't ignore the gnawing sense that something was coming, and she had no idea how much danger they were truly in. "I don't think we're serving any more tonight," Emma finally said, her words careful. "But let's not make a scene. Lock the front door and start cleaning up. We'll keep the lights low, but I don't want them thinking we've abandoned ship." Sandy nodded quickly, disappearing into the kitchen to gather the others. As the sound of scurrying feet filled the background, Bear leaned closer to Emma, his voice low and steady. "We'll rotate watches tonight," he said. "I'll stay with you, but we'll need to plan for anything. They've already made it clear this isn't going away." "I know," Emma replied, her voice resolute despite the tightness in her chest. "As long as they're out there, we can't let our guard down." The night crawled by, thick and heavy with anticipation. Tony's patrol returned without incident, but his grim expression told Emma all she needed to know. The vehicles across the street hadn't moved an inch, their silent presence a reminder that the battle lines had already been drawn. The bikers took turns keeping watch, their jackets pulled tight against the cold as they stood in silent formation. Inside the diner, Emma sat at one of the corner booths, her fingers wrapped around a mug of coffee she'd barely touched. Bear sat across from her, his arms crossed and his hat tilted low over his face. He looked every bit as exhausted as she felt, but his resolve hadn't faltered, not even for a moment. "They'll wait," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet and rough. "However long it takes, they'll wait until we show weakness. And when they do—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Emma didn't need him to. Before she could respond, a sudden sound shattered the calm, a sharp, tinny crash from the far side of the lot. Bear was on his feet instantly, his hand gesturing for Emma to stay put as he moved toward the door. Outside, the bikers were already tense, their attention snapping toward the disturbance. Tony was the first to reach the source, a lone motorcycle overturned, its tires spinning idly against the pavement. As he crouched to inspect it, his hand froze mid-motion. Nestled beneath the frame was a small, blinking red light. His breath caught sharply as he realized what it meant. "Bear!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the night. "We've got a bomb!" The words exploded into the air, louder and more chilling than the crash itself. Emma's heart leaped into her throat as the terrifying reality set in. This wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was war. The sound of Tony's voice carried like the clang of alarm bells, reverberating through the night air and cutting through the tense stillness that had settled over the diner. "We've got a bomb!" The words sparked an immediate and visceral reaction. Gasps, muttered curses, and the rush of feet toward the scene. Every leather-clad biker tensed as one, their instincts honed for flight or fight, while Emma froze on the diner steps, her breath caught in her chest. Bear stormed across the parking lot, his boots crunching against the asphalt until he reached Tony, whose pale face reflected the crimson blink of the small device nestled beneath the tipped-over motorcycle. The blinking red light was a stark contrast to the dark night, and it seemed to pulse in tandem with the collective realization of everyone gathered. This was no bluff. This was a warning-turned-weapon, a physical manifestation of the threat Laurent had been hinting at all along. "Everyone back!" Bear barked, his voice booming with authority and slicing through the chaotic murmurs. Bikers who had crowded closer immediately stepped back, their movements quick but measured, as though one false step could trigger the very thing they feared. "Clear the area, now!" Emma snapped out of her daze, her legs taking her forward instinctively before she hesitated, uncertain of where she should be or what she could do. Her diner, her sanctuary, felt meaningless in the shadow of this very real, very dangerous escalation. She glanced toward Bear and Tony, who remained crouched over the motorcycle, their heads close as they exchanged tense, quiet words. "You should get inside," Tony called out to her, glancing over his shoulder. "This isn't safe." But something inside Emma refused to retreat. "No," she said, her voice sharper than she'd expected and cutting across the rising tension. "I'm not hiding. If you're out here, I'm staying." Bear didn't look up, but the taut set of his shoulders suggested he respected the defiance, even if he didn't agree with it. "Fine," he muttered, "but stay out of the way." By now the bikers had formed a loose perimeter, spreading out across the lot and scanning their surroundings with the vigilance of soldiers. The unmarked vehicles across the street remained eerily still, but every biker knew those cars weren't empty. Their occupants were watching, waiting, and likely ready to act if things spiraled out of control. The tension was a living thing, coiled tight and ready to strike. "Tony," Bear said, his voice low and deliberate as he pointed to the device, "can you tell if it's live?" Tony shook his head, his expression grim. "I'm not an explosives expert, but it's wired. That much is clear. Someone wanted us to find this and make no mistake about what it is." "What are the chances it's a fake?" Emma asked, the question spilling out before she could consider the implications. Bear gave a short, humorless laugh. "Not the kind of thing you'd fake if you're trying to send this kind of message." Emma swallowed hard, her eyes drifting back to the blinking light. The reality of the situation was pressing down on her now, suffocating in its weight. "Then what do we do?" "We call someone who knows what they're doing," Tony said, already pulling a burner phone from his jacket. "We've got a old friend who's dealt with this kind of thing. He'll know if it's something we can disarm or if we need to call in the real cavalry." As he dialed, Bear stood to his full height, towering over the scene as he turned to address the bikers still holding their silent vigil. "Nobody touches this bike," he ordered, "and no one leaves the lot until we figure out our next move. We stay together." The united murmurs of agreement echoed across the lot, but the tension remained palpable. Everyone present understood the stakes. This wasn't just a test of resolve, it was a declaration of war. Laurent and his shadowy allies had escalated the game beyond words, and now the clock was ticking in more ways than one. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as Tony waited for his contact to pick up, the phone pressed tightly to his ear. When the call finally connected, his relief was audible, though his tone remained brisk as he rattled off the situation and their coordinates. "Now," he said after a brief pause. "How fast can you get here?" He ended the call and turned back to Bear and Emma, tension etched into every line of his face. "He'll be here in 20 minutes, maybe less, but we need to secure this area in the meantime. They might have left this as bait, and there's no guarantee they don't have something else planned for when we let our guard down." As if on cue, the faint hum of an engine reached their ears, growing louder with each passing second. Heads turned sharply toward the sound, and within moments, the sleek black car that had become all too familiar in recent hours rolled into view. It stopped just shy of the lot, its engine idling ominously as the driver's side door opened. Laurent stepped out, his tailored suit pristine and his expression maddeningly calm despite the chaos his people had orchestrated. He took a step forward, hands casually tucked into his pockets as though he were strolling into a casual meeting rather than a potential disaster. Bear moved to block his path, his imposing frame casting a long shadow across the asphalt. "Not one step closer," he growled, his voice trembling with barely restrained fury. "You've done enough for one night." Laurent smiled faintly, tilting his head as though Bear's anger amused him. "Done enough?" "Oh, Bear," he said lightly, gesturing toward the motorcycle and its blinking payload. "This isn't my doing. But I suppose you'll think what you will." Emma stepped forward before she could stop herself, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "If this isn't your doing," she said, her tone sharp and demanding, "then why are you here?" Laurent's smile widened, his eyes gleaming with something unreadable. "To watch," he said simply, "and to see how quickly you unravel." The cliffhanger stretched taut as Laurent's words hung in the air, their meaning chillingly clear. Whatever game he was playing, it was far from over, and the stakes had never been higher. The chilled night air carried a strained silence into Emma's lungs as her gaze flickered from the blinking red light on the bomb to Laurent. The faint glint of the overhead parking lot lamp off his polished shoes made his presence feel even more invasive, even more surreal. How could this man stand there so casually when a real threat, wired to hurt everyone here, loomed only steps away? It was as if chaos followed him, intentionally and effortlessly, like a shadow he could not be separated from. Bear hadn't moved, his large frame standing between Laurent and the rest of the group. His sheer stillness was a statement of its own, but Emma could see the muscles in his forearm tighten as his patience reached its limits. "You think this is some kind of game?" Bear growled, his voice uncharacteristically sharp, cutting through the tension like a warning shot. "Because no one here is playing." Laurent took another small step forward, his hands comfortably in his pockets, and tilted his head as though Bear's question carried some amusement. "Games have rules," Laurent said, his grin cold and precise. This is influence. This is power. And right now, Bear, you are struggling to grasp how much more I wield than anyone standing on this lot." He gestured casually at the swirling group of bikers, the tight circle they had formed around the bomb site. Emma's foot shifted forward involuntarily, her mind racing as she searched for an opening, for control in a scene, spiraling into something far more dangerous. "If you're so powerful," she said sharply, her voice betraying only traces of the fear gripping her chest, "then why show up here personally? Why dirty your suit standing next to us?" Laurent's gaze snapped to her, a flicker of what might have been admiration mixed with frustration shadowing his sharp features. "That's the thing," he replied, his voice hushed and deliberate. "Sometimes you have to step down into the trenches to remind people why you own the battlefield. If not, they start to think they're equals. They start to think they matter." Emma swallowed but didn't back down. The air between them felt thin now, crackling with tension from words not yet spoken. Suddenly, a darkened sedan pulled up abruptly at the edge of the already too full parking lot, its headlights slicing broad beams through the collected bodies. The car had barely come to a halt when its doors opened, discharging two figures who moved with precision. One of them, a man in his late 40s with a weathered face and a gray crew cut, immediately screamed professionalism. The duffel bag in his hand said it all. This was the high-stakes fixer Tony had called, the expert who'd been asked to defuse whatever bomb was sitting there as a symbol of someone else's grip on power. "Who called the explosives guy?" Laurent quipped, although he didn't sound surprised. As the newcomer approached, Laurent's expression grew sharper, less playful now. This doesn't concern third parties. Bear stepped sideways enough to allow the fixer to meet Laurent's gaze without barriers. It concerns anyone who's a target, Bear said plainly, crossing his arms again, which means just about everyone here. The fixer didn't engage in the verbal sparring. Instead, he went directly to the bike, crouching at the bomb's hive of wires and lights as he pulled gloves and tools from his bag. Every movement was calm and unhurried, despite the rising tension his presence had thickened. The bikers leaned in slightly, still watching their perimeters, but unable to ignore the gravity of the scene unfolding feet away. Emma watched him work, her nerves ratcheting up with every flick of his tools on the bomb. All she could think about was the diner, the haven she had built and worked for, now holding its collective breath alongside her. She tore her gaze away and looked at Laurent again, her voice teetering between anger and fear. "If this isn't your work," she gritted, "why are you still here?" Laurent's gaze lingered on the bunker-style toolkit the fixer was assembling, then slowly returned to her. "Because I want to see how you handle decisions bigger than yourself," he said. "Because you've started something too loud to ignore." Before Emma could fire back, the fixer raised his voice without turning from his work. "This bomb is wired legit," he announced cleanly, causing a ripple of silent dread among all who overheard. "High grade, professionally assembled. Whoever wanted this here knew what they were doing." He paused, lifting a hand to silence questions. "No movement yet. Anyone wants to evacuate? Now might be the time." "Evacuate over my dead body," Bear grunted, planting his boots firmly, and his growled words were met with scattered murmurs of agreement from the bikers. Emma didn't move either, nor did anyone else. As ridiculous and irresponsible as it sounded for them to stand their ground, nobody wanted to be the first domino to fall in front of Laurent's smug, waiting eyes. Time stretched elastic, seconds feeling like hours. The fixer's hands moved faster now, severing wires with care. Emma watched so closely, her breath seemed to sync with the cutter's snips and clicks. Finally, one decisive motion caused the blinking red light to still. The fixer raised his hand to signal, calm permeating the room despite the clamor of engines from across the street. "Safe," the man said tersely. "Clean, professional, no unnecessary emotion." But the relief swept quickly through the bikers, evident in their rolling shoulders and exchanged looks. Laurent, however, barely reacted. "One small victory," he mused. "It looks good on you." Then, with cruel laughter dimming outside his black sedan's closing door, he left them with the unshakable knowledge. Small moments of triumph couldn't last forever. The gravel beneath the bikers' boots crunched faintly as the group shifted uneasily. The faint trace of diesel exhaust lingered in the cool night air, the signature left behind by Laurent's now-absent sedan. Amidst the sea of leather vests and hardened faces, the weight of his final taunt bore heavily on them all. In the middle of it, Emma stood silent, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, though the cold was not what caused her to tremble. Her eyes fixed on the now-disarmed bomb lying inert on the ground, each severed wire a reminder of just how far things had escalated. Bear scanned the perimeter, his sharp gaze briefly settling on every rider still standing guard. His presence alone seemed to anchor the crowd in place, but even he couldn't project the same steadiness as before. While the crisis appeared diffused for now, everyone knew Laurent's departure wasn't the end. It was an intermission in a much larger game, and no one could predict the next move. "We need to regroup," Bear growled after a long silence. His voice cut through the quiet, firm and resolute as always. "Whatever they're planning, this isn't going to stop here. Laurent doesn't drop something like this and walk away." He gestured toward the disarmed device, now packed into a steel container the fixer had brought for safe transport. That was a message. The next one won't come with a warning. Emma nodded but stayed quiet. Her pulse was still racing, her thoughts tangled in a maze of questions that had no easy answers. How could they prepare for what was coming when they didn't even know the shape of the threat? Every instinct told her to close the diner, lock the doors, and tell everyone to go home to protect themselves while they still could. But the chain of events she had set into motion wasn't simply hers to control anymore. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't even about Tony or the bikers. It was about standing up when no one else would. And there was no turning back now. The fixer stood off to the side, methodically securing his equipment back into his duffel bag. He moved with the same unhurried efficiency as before, but his eyes darted occasionally toward the waiting vehicles still parked across the street. The tension hanging in the air was impossible to ignore. Finally, he zipped the bag shut and turned to Bear. "That's all I can do here," the fixer said evenly. "The device is neutralized, but it's a professional job, not some back alley attempt. The people you're dealing with, they know what they're doing. They've got resources, manpower, and they're not afraid to push limits. This is more organized than it looks." Bear's jaw tightened, his hands flexing at his sides. "You're saying this wasn't just Laurent's idea? He's working for someone higher up?" The fixer didn't respond immediately, his lips pressing into a thin line before finally speaking. "I can't confirm who's pulling the strings, but yeah. This operation has the fingerprints of something bigger. You've stirred up a hornet's nest, and it's not going to settle on its own." Emma's shoulders stiffened, her frayed nerves rekindling a flame of frustration. "So what are we supposed to do? Wait for them to try again? Keep playing their game until they decide they've taught us enough of a lesson?" The fixer met her eyes, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "You need to think about your next steps carefully," he said, "because the minute you make the wrong move, they'll come down hard and they won't miss." Emma bit back her frustration. She already knew that. She didn't need anyone to tell her they were walking a razor's edge. She could feel it with every bone in her body. The question wasn't whether they could stay balanced. The question was whether it was worth falling for. Bear motioned for the fixer to step aside, his focus shifting back to the group surrounding them. "We double up patrols," he said sharply, his voice commanding immediate attention. "If you're on watch tonight, stay sharp. No distractions. If anyone sees anything, we move fast. Don't assume we've got time to spare." The bikers murmured their assent, their faces stoic but resolute. Emma couldn't help but notice the occasional glances they cast toward her, not of blame, but of something heavier. Expectation. Whether she wanted to be or not, she had become their focal point, their reason for standing against an enemy far larger than any of them had anticipated. As Bear began assigning riders to specific positions around the diner, Tony approached Emma, his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of his leather jacket. His expression was guarded but softer than usual. "You holding up?" he asked quietly. Emma glanced at him, her lips curving into a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Define holding up." Tony huffed a quiet, almost laugh, shaking his head. "You're tougher than most people here, you know that? Not just for calling those cops out that day, just standing here now. Not a lot of folks would still be fighting if they were in your shoes." His words should have comforted her, but they only added to the weight pressing on her chest. "I don't feel tough," she admitted. "Most of the time, I'm barely holding it together. But if we stop now, then what was any of this for?" Tony nodded, his gaze steady. "That's what makes you tough." He paused before adding, "Laurent underestimated that. He thinks you'll fold." Emma's eyes narrowed slightly, her jaw tightening. "Then maybe it's time we stop playing defense. Maybe we need to show him, and whoever he's working for, that we're not just going to sit back and let them call the shots." Tony raised an eyebrow, the faintest hint of a smirk tugging at his lips. "You've got something in mind?" Before Emma could respond, the sharp wail of sirens split through the air, piercing the fragile calm. Every head turned toward the sound, the distant glow of flashing lights reflecting against the darkened street. Emma felt her stomach lurch as the noise grew louder, closer, until it was clear the sirens weren't passing by, they were coming straight for them. The piercing wail of sirens echoed closer, and the collective unease in the diner's parking lot tightened like a coiled spring. Every pair of eyes swiveled toward the flashing red and blue lights cresting the road ahead. Adrenaline surged through Emma's veins, her pulse quickening at the undeniable sign that the fragile calm they had wrestled to maintain was about to shatter once more. Bear didn't wait for the first squad car to screech into the lot before issuing orders. "Everyone tighten up!" he barked. His tone was steel, his voice carrying over the revving of distant engines. The bikers, already on edge, moved instinctively, forming a protective line around the diner. Their presence was both a declaration and a warning. Whatever storm was about to hit, they wouldn't be caught unprepared. Emma stepped up beside Tony, her expression set despite the fear gnawing at the edges of her resolve. She could feel the weight of the night pressing down on her. Laurent's threats, the planted bomb, the creeping realization that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about principle. It was about making a stand when no one else dared. Tony glanced at her, his jaw tense. "You good?" "Ask me again when this is over," she replied, her voice tight but unwavering. The first squad car slid to a stop at the entrance to the lot, the gravel spitting out from beneath its tires. Two officers stepped out, one older and grizzled, the other younger, his nervous steps betraying inexperience. Behind them, another vehicle rolled up, this one black and unmarked, its windows tinted to the point of opacity. The older officer surveyed the scene with a hardened scowl, his hand resting a little too comfortably on the holster at his hip. His eyes scanned the sea of leather-clad bikers, the faintest flicker of conflict crossing his features before he turned his attention to Bear. "Evening," the officer began, his tone measured but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Quite the crowd you've got here. Care to explain why my station got a call about an incident involving explosives? Or why you're all standing out here like you're gearing up for war?" Bear stepped forward, his bulk blocking the officer's view of Emma and the rest of the group behind him. "We had a situation," he said evenly, keeping his voice calm but firm. "Handled it before anyone got hurt. There's no need for you to be here." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by the answer. "Well, here's the thing," he said, taking a step closer. "When you've got bikers filling up a diner parking lot, neutralizing what sounds like a damn bomb, we tend to take a vested interest. So I'm going to ask again, what's going on here?" Before Bear could respond, the door to the unmarked vehicle swung open. Out stepped a man in a crisp suit, his shoes clicking sharply against the asphalt. Emma's stomach clenched at the sight of his face. It was Laurent. "Why don't you let me handle this, officer?" Laurent said, his voice smooth and soaked in condescension. He adjusted his cuffs as he strode toward the assembled group, his gaze lingering on Emma for just a moment too long. "After all, these fine folks and I have unfinished business." Bear's stance widened, his arms crossing over his chest as Laurent stopped a few paces in front of him. "We don't need you here," Bear growled, "unless you're here to turn yourself in for planting that bomb." A ripple of murmured agreement passed through the bikers, their voices low but weighted. The tension in the air was palpable, a live wire stretched taut between the two figures standing at the center of it all. Laurent smirked, his head tilting slightly as if amused by the accusation. "Such colorful assumptions," he said lightly, "but if I were behind such a thing, do you think I'd be foolish enough to show my face here tonight?" "I think you're exactly that arrogant," Emma interjected, stepping forward despite the warning look Bear shot her way. Her voice was steady, her gaze locked on Laurent's sharp features. "You keep showing up because you want us to fold, to crumble under the pressure, but all you're doing is proving how desperate you are." For the first time, Laurent's smirk faltered. His expression hardened, his eyes narrowing as he took a measured step closer to Emma. "Desperation is a matter of perspective," he said coolly, his tone dropping low enough that it felt like a private warning masked as casual conversation. "And you, Miss Reed, should be very careful about what lines you're willing to cross. The deeper you dig, the more you'll regret it." Bear moved to intercept Laurent, placing himself between him and Emma once again. "That's enough," he said firmly. "You've made your threats. Now get back in your car and leave, before we really give the officers something to write in their report tonight." The older cop, who had been watching the exchange with a mix of annoyance and caution, finally stepped forward. "All right, that's enough," he barked. "Whatever this is," he gestured vaguely between Laurent, Bear, and Emma, "it's crossing into territory we're not going to tolerate. Everyone here needs to clear out or we'll start making arrests. Got it?" Laurent took a step back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "Of course, officer," he said smoothly, though the venom in his tone was unmistakable. "Always happy to cooperate." Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode back to his car. The sound of his door slamming shut echoed across the lot as his vehicle reversed and disappeared into the night, but the tension he left behind was thicker than ever. Bear turned to Emma, his expression grim. "We're running out of time. The next move has to be ours." Emma nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we'll make it count."